The 1960s and 1970s were more than just decades in history. They were periods of profound transformation in culture, society, and music. These eras ignited a creative fire that not only revolutionized the way music was made but also how it was perceived and experienced. From the groundbreaking experimentation of the late 60s to the rebellious energy of the 70s, these 2 decades continue to influence artists and inspire listeners today. Music, in the 60s and 70s, became a reflection of the changing times. It captured the spirit of the counterculture, the battle for civil rights, the psychedelic explorations, the rise of political consciousness, and the search for personal freedom. The songs and movements that emerged during these years didn't just entertain, they challenged, comforted, and uplifted a generation. They became anthems of change, of revolution, and of peace, pushing boundaries and reshaping the future of sound, technology, and how we engage with music. This article delves into how the music of the 1960s and 1970s inspired not only the people who lived through them but also the generations that followed, leaving an enduring legacy that continues to shape contemporary music. The social and cultural landscape of the 1960s and 1970s. To understand how the music of the 60s and 70s inspired a generation, we need to look at the broader cultural context of the time. These decades were marked by significant social upheaval and transformation. From the civil rights movement to the rise of feminism, the counterculture movement, anti-Vietnam War protests, and the growing popularity of psychedelic substances, the 60s and 70s were marked by a deep desire for change. Music became the soundtrack to these shifting tides, a voice for the voiceless, and a symbol of rebellion. The power of protest and political music. In the 1960s, music became an undeniable vehicle for political expression. Songs like Bob Dylan's "Blowin' in the Wind" (1962), Buffalo Springfield's "For What It's Worth" (1966), and The Byrds' "Turn, Turn, Turn" (1965), addressed themes of war, peace, civil rights, and social justice. These songs not only resonated deeply with the struggles of the time but also inspired individuals to take action. Dylan, in particular, became an emblem of this era, with his powerful lyrics challenging the status quo and calling for social change. As a poet and activist, his work connected deeply with the anti-war and civil rights movements, making him a symbol of youthful defiance and activism. The generation of the 60s didn't just listen to music, they felt it in their bones, using it as a soundtrack for their protests and demonstrations. As the 1970s progressed, political music continued to play an important role, with artists like Neil Young and John Lennon continuing to critique war, inequality, and political corruption. The 70s also saw the rise of glam rock and the beginnings of punk rock, both of which were expressions of youthful defiance in the face of societal pressures. These subgenres blurred the lines between personal expression and political resistance, fueling further innovation in music. The psychedelic revolution and the birth of new sounds. Perhaps no other genre embodies the spirit of the 60s and 70s more than psychedelic rock, a genre that emerged in the mid-60s and reached its height in the late 60s and early 70s. Influenced by the use of psychedelic substances and a growing interest in expanding consciousness, psychedelic rock revolutionized music by introducing new sounds, recording techniques, and concepts. The influence of the Beatles and the psychedelic sound. The Beatles were the driving force behind much of the musical experimentation of the 60s. Their shift from pop idols to cultural innovators is best exemplified by their landmark 1967 album Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band, which fused rock with orchestral, Indian, and avant-garde influences. The album introduced the world to a new kind of studio wizardry, with the use of tape loops, reversed tracks, and unconventional instruments like the sitar. Songs like "Lucy in the Sky with Diamonds" and "A Day in the Life" captured the surreal, dreamlike quality of the psychedelic experience, while also pushing the boundaries of what pop music could achieve. The Beatles' embrace of psychedelic aesthetics paved the way for countless other bands to experiment with sound, production, and form. The Grateful Dead, Jefferson Airplane, and Pink Floyd, all key figures in the psychedelic movement, brought their own unique contributions to the genre. The Grateful Dead, for example, pioneered the concept of the live album as a representation of their freewheeling, improvisational performances. The influence of the acid rock sound, characterized by long instrumental solos, surreal lyrics, and an embrace of freedom and individuality, became an essential part of the music scene. As psychedelic rock merged with other styles, it helped shape the direction of progressive rock, art rock, and glam rock, all of which would dominate the 1970s and inspire countless artists in the decades to come. The rise of rock and roll and the birth of the rock star. While the 60s focused heavily on experimentation and expanding the boundaries of music, the 70s saw the rise of the rock star as a cultural icon. This era saw the birth of arena rock, hard rock, and glam rock, which centered around larger-than-life personalities and performances. The guitar riff became a symbol of rebellion, and Led Zeppelin, the Rolling Stones, and Queen became legends not only for their groundbreaking music but for their larger-than-life personas. The 70s gave birth to rock's most enduring anthems, fueled by guitar-heavy riffs and soaring vocals. Led Zeppelin's Stairway to Heaven, 1971, The Rolling Stones' Brown Sugar, 1971, and Queen's Bohemian Rhapsody, 1975, represent the pinnacle of 70s rock. These songs were masterpieces of sound and structure, showcasing musical virtuosity and an ability to blend genres like blues, folk, and classical with the bombastic energy of rock. For young people in the 60s and 70s, these bands provided a soundtrack to a new era of rebellion and individuality. The figures who fronted these bands, Robert Plant, Mick Jagger, and Freddie Mercury, became symbols of freedom, sexual liberation, and self-expression. Their music gave voice to the collective desire to break free from societal norms and embrace a more liberated lifestyle. The birth of punk rock and the DIY ethic as the 1970s wore on, the optimistic idealism of the 60s began to give way to a more cynical view of society. Disillusioned by the failure of the counterculture's promises, many young people turned to punk rock as a new form of expression. Born out of the underground music scenes of New York and London, punk rock was stripped down, raw, and defiant, mirroring the frustrations of the youth at the time. Punk rejected the excesses of the 70s rock star image, instead embracing a DIY, do-it-yourself, ethic that encouraged ordinary people to pick up guitars and start bands. The Ramones, The Clash, and Sex Pistols embodied this new spirit of rebellion, creating music that was loud, fast, and direct. With songs like Blitzkrieg Bop and Anarchy in the UK, punk rockers adopted a blunt, no-nonsense approach to music that rejected the complex arrangements of the previous decade. Punk also addressed the growing alienation felt by many youth, speaking directly to their anger, frustration, and disillusionment with mainstream society. This raw honesty and simplicity, coupled with the punk's revolutionary aesthetic, sparked a new wave of musical creativity and political activism. The enduring influence. How the 60s and 70s continue to inspire music today. The legacy of the 1960s and 1970s is woven into the very fabric of modern music. The genres born in these decades, rock, blues, folk, soul, punk, and more, have evolved and merged, but the core elements of innovation, rebellion, and self-expression remain as relevant today as they were 50 years ago. Modern genres and the influence of the 60s and 70s. Today's rock, indie, and alternative music owe much to the musical advancements made in the 60s and 70s. Bands like Arctic Monkeys, Tame Impala, and The Strokes draw heavily from the sounds of the 60s, whether it's in their use of simple yet infectious guitar riffs or their nods to the psychedelic experimentation of that era. Even the post-punk movement that emerged in the 80s and continues today directly traces its roots to the DIY ethos of the 70s. The genre of hip-hop, which emerged in the 80s, also owes a great debt to the music of the 60s and 70s. Early hip-hop producers sampled from the funk, soul, and rock records of the 60s and 70s, using these iconic sounds to create new beats and rhythms that would shape the genre. Artists like Kanye West, J. Cole, and Outkast have all drawn from the revolutionary sounds of that era, using them to create some of the most groundbreaking music of today. The lasting impact on music culture and youth identity. The music of the 1960s and 1970s not only influenced sound but also shaped the way music interacts with culture, particularly youth identity. These decades birthed a cultural shift where music wasn't just something to listen to, it became a way of life. The musicians who emerged in this era were not just performers, they became living symbols of the values and movements that they embodied. Music became a rallying cry for individuals seeking purpose, community, and meaning in the face of rapid social change. Music as a form of personal and collective identity. The 60s and 70s were a time of searching for self-expression and personal identity. With social and political upheavals marking these decades, young people found in music a way to define themselves and make sense of the world. Music was a communal experience, from listening to albums with friends to gathering at concerts that often felt like spiritual experiences. Whether it was the peace-loving ethos of the Woodstock generation or the raw energy of punk rock's rebellious stance, music became a medium for defining personal values, attitudes, and the rejection of mainstream culture. In the 60s, the rise of the counterculture, a rejection of materialism, conformity, and traditional values, was fueled by the music of artists like the Beatles, Jimi Hendrix, and Janis Joplin. Their songs, imbued with messages of peace, love, and freedom, resonated with a generation determined to break free from the constraints of the past. The counterculture movement found in rock and folk music not only an escape from societal norms but also a form of protest against war, inequality, and injustice. By the 1970s, this spirit of rebellion was further amplified with the punk rock movement. Punk, with its DIY ethos, disillusioned attitude, and raw aggression, was a direct response to the perceived commercialization of the music industry and the excesses of the 70s rock scene. Bands like The Clash, Sex Pistols, and Ramones created music that was stripped down, fast-paced, and often politically charged, reflecting the frustration and disillusionment of the youth of the era. For the youth of the time, these musicians weren't just creating songs, they were providing anthems for personal and collective transformation. Music became a language through which individuals could communicate their deepest feelings, frustrations, and desires. The connection between music and identity became inseparable, with entire subcultures, such as the hippie movement and punk culture, emerging around certain styles and genres. The birth of iconic music festivals, a cultural revolution. The 1960s and 70s were also pivotal in the evolution of live music culture. Music festivals, which would become significant cultural events, emerged as a central part of the music scene. These festivals were more than just concerts, they became expressions of the counterculture and spaces where people could come together to experience the power of music as a collective force. Woodstock, the icon of peace and love. Perhaps no event in music history is as emblematic of the 1960s as Woodstock. Held in August 1969, this festival brought together over 400,000 people and featured legendary performances from artists like Jimi Hendrix, Janis Joplin, The Who, and Jefferson Airplane. Woodstock was the culmination of the hippie movement, a space where people could live freely, experiment, and celebrate the spirit of peace, love, and unity. Though the festival was famously described as an Aquarian exposition, 3 days of peace and music, it also served as a political statement. Amid the Vietnam War and the rise of social movements, Woodstock represented an alternative vision of society, one based on harmony, togetherness, and respect for the earth and one another. The festival's messages of unity and anti-authoritarianism resonated deeply with the youth of the time, reinforcing the idea that music could be a powerful tool for social change. Glastonbury and the evolution of music festivals. The success of Woodstock inspired the creation of many other music festivals in the 1970s, including the Glastonbury Festival in the UK, which continues to be one of the world's largest and most iconic music festivals. The essence of these festivals, blending music with cultural and political activism, has endured into modern times. Today, festivals like Glastonbury, Coachella, and Bonnaroo are not just about the music, they are about the experience, the gathering, and the shared sense of belonging. They reflect the legacy of the 60s and 70s, where music was a space for people to find their voices, express their individuality, and connect with like-minded individuals. The festival culture that emerged during the 60s and 70s created a template for how music can serve as a vehicle for broader social, cultural, and political expression. Music as a means of healing and self-expression. One of the most profound legacies of the 1960s and 1970s is the way music became a tool for healing, self-exploration, and personal growth. With the rapid pace of change, political turmoil, and societal shifts, music provided a means for individuals to process their emotions, challenge their thoughts, and make sense of the world around them. The role of music in mental health and psychedelic exploration during the 1960s, the increasing popularity of psychedelic substances like LSD encouraged many musicians and listeners to explore new ways of thinking and perceiving the world. Bands like Pink Floyd, The Doors, and the Velvet Underground helped shape a new musical aesthetic that combined experimental sound with introspective and often surreal lyrics. For many, music became a tool for introspection and self-exploration. Albums like The Beatles' Revolver, 1966, and The Velvet Underground and Nico, 1967, pushed the boundaries of songwriting and production, blending avant-garde elements with the raw honesty of personal experience. Music wasn't just a form of entertainment, it was a transformative experience, a way to connect with deeper layers of the self. As the 70s unfolded, these psychedelic influences melded into other genres, including art rock, progressive rock, and soul, with bands like Yes, King Crimson, and David Bowie using music to explore concepts of identity, existence, and the human condition. The emotional depth of songs during this period, combined with a growing acceptance of diverse experiences and viewpoints, cemented music's role as a medium for personal expression and emotional healing. The global influence of 60s and 70s music. While the music of the 1960s and 1970s was deeply rooted in Western cultures, its influence quickly spread worldwide, impacting music scenes in Europe, Latin America, Africa, and Asia. These decades saw the merging of Western rock influences with traditional music from various cultures, creating cross-cultural fusion that helped shape the future of world music. The birth of world music fusion in the 60s, the Beatles were particularly instrumental in introducing Indian classical music to Western audiences, particularly through their experimentation with the sitar on tracks like Norwegian Wood, 1965. This sparked a broader interest in Eastern sounds, which would later influence the work of the Rolling Stones, George Harrison, and many others. The Afrobeat movement in Africa, pioneered by Nigerian musician Fela Kuti, blended traditional African rhythms with jazz, funk, and rock, while reggae from Jamaica, with artists like Bob Marley, brought social consciousness and political activism to the forefront through the genre's iconic rhythms and messages of peace and unity. Similarly, in Latin America, Carlos Santana's fusion of rock and Latin rhythms brought global attention to the diverse sounds of the region. The cross-pollination of musical styles and cultural expressions led to a more globalized view of music, where the lines between genres blurred and music became a truly universal language. The music of the 60s and 70s, with its openness to new sounds and social messages, played a pivotal role in this cultural exchange, promoting unity and understanding across borders. Music as a tool for revolution and personal liberation. The 1960s and 1970s were transformational decades for music, and their influence continues to shape the soundtracks of our lives today. The music of these eras was revolutionary not just in its sound, but in its capacity to inspire change, to reflect the struggles of the time, and to empower individuals to take control of their own lives and destinies. From the idealistic dreams of peace and love to the raw power of punk rock rebellion, music during the 60s and 70s represented both the hope for a better world and the anger at the injustices of the time. This music was more than entertainment, it was a force for change, a tool for self-expression, and a medium for understanding the complex and often turbulent world in which people lived. Through their songs, artists of the 60s and 70s became beacons of transformation, guiding their generation through a time of profound social upheaval and inspiring future generations to find their own voices. As As we continue to reflect on the music of the 60s and 70s, we recognize that its legacy is not confined to its historical moment. The music of these decades continues to inspire, to provoke, and to connect people in ways that transcend time, proving that the power of music to shape culture and identity remains as strong today as it was during those groundbreaking years.